ladies and gentlemen, welcome to You Are Wrong. Today with a little bit of a different start. As you might have seen, we now have advertisements. That's because we've started to monetize our channel. I hope this does not bear too big an inconvenience for you. Today's episode will be a little special. We have a very interesting guest for you, and we're talking about the new Strokes album. But before we'll do so, Chris is with us again. Hello, Chris. Where are you right now?
What's up? Main Man is back. First things first, I want to give a shout out to everybody who's still holding it down in these crazy ass times. As you can see, globetrotting as usual.
That's very cool. And how are things going there?
Can't tell you yet. Let's talk about the Strokes again. So, I've already said what I said in this album, so I won't say too much. One, the Ode to Mets. It's a jam. It's a hot jam. Also, I read in an NME.com article that Billie Eilish can't stop listening to Strokes. I don't know if it's an endorsement, but I guess we take what we can get in this economy. And trust me, we take what we can get.
Alright, then without further ado, let's get right into this new episode on the new album of The Strokes. The Strokes are back! 7 years after their last LP and 4 years after a mostly ignored EP, the new Abnormal hit with thundering fan appraisal and critical praise, mid-tempo lead single and Basquiat cover art and all. Never mind the fact that people didn't really care for the Strokes over a decade, and so-called zeitgeist writers heralded the death of indie and end of all guitar music various times over the past few years. Never mind that most of the music press has largely lost the attachment to young audience tastes and regressed into navel-gazing. For some weird, absolutely incomprehensible reason, indie is back. Who would have thought? Of course, I did. It didn't take a master's degree in pop culture to foresee why 2020 would be the year of the Strokes. Never mind corona quarantines and shifting popular narratives and culture sections. So, in a way, talking about the new Abnormal means that we have to talk about the Strokes as a cultural touchstone, and why a band this transparently referential and understated managed to not only reach superstardom, but recorded what can now be understood as key works of two eras. So strap in, and let's take a journey back to the start of a new, exciting millennium. The year is 2000, and it's an odd year for music. The 90s had just ended, the world didn't go down in a major New Year's Day debacle, and worldwide charts were almost uniformly dominated by two main factors: mainstream rap and bubblegum pop. Teen pop? Bubblegum pop. Remember DMX, Ja Rule and Nelly? Well, they all had #1 records in 2000. Weird to think back to how popular those guys really were. There's also Eminem and Outkast, probably the most lasting examples in regards to still relevant pop culture. And a lot of R&B. D'Angelo, R. Kelly, Craig David, that sort of thing. Sold millions. Tons and tons of records, my god. Bubblegum pop, oh my. Madonna, Backstreet Boys, and Sync. Jesus, it was dark times. But most characteristically of all, one record would dominate the public consciousness for years to come. Britney Spears' Oops, I Did It Again. Spears' mixture of schoolgirl innocence and teen horniness, she literally covered Satisfaction on this. My god, hit big and marked the rise of the synthetic pop star, an entity whose entire output, behavior, image and style would be dictated by big corporate input. A development which famously had Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins state his band broke up because there's just too many Britneys in the world. Speaking of the Smashing Pumpkins, the 2000s also marked a changing of the guard of Gen X alternative rock. Most of the large bands of that era now defunct or caught up in rehashing former glories, little was left of the once sprawling movement that constituted American indie and grunge circles. Across the Atlantic, Britpop was struggling with itself, burying itself in bombast and striving to incorporate foreign influences into their sonic structures, making for a progressive shift from guitar to electronic sounds. Rock wasn't really dead, but changing, and within that resulting vacuum came new metal. Yeah, macho and rough and angry and new metal abandoned the frustrated sarcasm of Nirvana, the Pumpkins and Pearl Jam for all-out nihilism and Red Bull-flavored irony, presenting sing-along metal riffs accompanied by fast white rap. And it sold millions of units. I still kind of dig it. Don't tell that to anybody. Especially Chocolate Starfish, with Wes Borland's weird post-Aladdin insane makeup choices and unique guitar style, somewhere between shoegaze and world music references, is wildly underrated. And don't get me started on how good White Pony is, bloody masterpiece. But point being, music had shifted from the kaleidoscopic, subtle nuances of the 90s to pretty easily categorized cliches and norms. Big titties, angry boys, lucha tats, and cool bros, masculinism versus demure pseudo-feminism. The left field exception only proved the rule, as it largely came in Gen X survivors that were aggressively counter-positioning themselves. Or maybe club scenes, but let's keep them out of here because they weren't really involved in the music that had an impact on the charts. You know, this kind of reminds me of something? Some current era? Entrance, a few rich kids from New York, who looked on in stupor as the pop cultural landscape embraced a return of big money influence. The Strokes understood that the past decade had almost entirely ignored the once blossoming sounds of New York's CBGB scene, a cool and distinguished wave sound that harkened back to the Velvet Underground and early Talking Heads. But hey, don't just take it from me. Here's Gordon Raphael, producer of Is This It, with his own views and opinions of how the record came to be.
The last big movement that happened in rock music, where rock music was really influencing in a big way culture, was the Seattle grunge movement. Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Mudhoney, all of that was like raging from about 91 to about 96. And after Kurt Cobain offed himself and Soundgarden broke up and a lot of other bands started going down into heavy drug addiction, that scene kind of went over. In a lot of ways, that was the last big hurrah for rock music in the mainstream. And pretty soon, acid jazz, house music, all kinds of dance, electronic, drum and bass, and jungle started really coming up in the subculture. And of course, pop music and hip hop started rising up in the mainstream culture. For a while there, right before the Strokes came out, rock and roll was an extremely unpopular form in England and in the United States. It wasn't like no big deal. People weren't talking about rock music very much. I mean, it just wasn't happening. And in New York City, when you go out to clubs, there'd be DJs spinning acid jazz. In the charts, you know, they had NSYNC and Mariah Carey and Janet Jackson. That was the stuff that people were talking about. And there was a whole generation of young people that really hated rock music and guitar music. Like their older brothers were listening to it, and all they wanted to do was get hip to electronic dance music. That was the big thing in the young culture. I had a recording studio in the East Village in New York. I had lived in New York for a couple of years, moving there from Seattle. Every night I went to clubs looking for bands or musicians that I liked, and I'd hand them my business card and say, come make demos with me. That was my job, was recording bands, and I was just starting off. Like, I'd only been doing it professionally for 2 years, and I never wanted to be a producer. I was just going to be a musician, but I happened to know how to record, and I was working in my own studio, and pretty soon bands found me, and I started a career. So to further this career and pay the rent in New York City, which was a lot more than in Seattle, I just went to every band that seemed interesting or cool of any kind and just, hey, here's my card, come see my studio. I saw the Strokes play at a place called Luna Lounge, a small club that was free admission. Every night had 3 bands playing, and I went there all the time. I gave them my business card, and they wound up coming in to record with me. So they said, will you help us and make 3 songs that we can show to clubs and maybe get better gigs? And so I made them a deal. You record 3 songs in 3 days. I think I charged them like $200 a song. Nick Valenci reminded me of that. I thought it was $300, but he said $200, and I believe him. And so, yeah, we just made a demo for them, 3 songs.
A rejection of current day trends, lead singer Julian Casablancas specifically told Raphael he wanted the Strokes to sound like a band from the past that time traveled to the future to record the album, emphasizing a live sound largely absent from the big budget studio products of the era.
What would you like to sound like? We want to sound like what everyone else is doing. That's not what we want to do. So what would that happy. Like, that's what they told me. It was like a riddle. When I asked them, what do you want to sound like? Had the mic set up, had the band come in and say, like, so what are we doing here? What are you looking for your sound? And the basic answer was, what everyone else is doing in New York, that's what we don't want to do. That gave me an instant clue because of years of recording my own music. I thought, well, what everyone's doing is everyone's using Pro Tools now. It was the beginning of really the ramp up of Pro Tools. Every producer wanted to use all 64 tracks on their sounds. Prodigy, Nine Inch Nails, this onslaught of giant sound based on the new digital technology that was coming out. So that is how they approached it, and my idea was, what's the opposite of that? Well, I have 8 microphones. I'm capable of recording 8 microphones with my 888 Pro Tools input. Go out there and play your song, and we'll capture it with 8 microphones, and that'll be it. In a way, it wasn't a revolutionary technique by any means in the history of recording, but it was definitely something that kids from that era never heard. It just never came across that sound. This was a band that only played free shows in the neighborhood near my studio. They weren't touring. This was a band that played a show every couple months at some clubs in the neighborhood for free. So then they made a demo. They had a brand new manager. When I met the Strokes, they were 20 and 22 years old. And they had a friend who wanted to manage them, who was also the same age as them, who was working in the booking department at Mercury Lounge Club. This guy's name is Ryan Gentles. He's still their manager. And he asked his boss, said, man, this band I want to start managing has made a demo and it's pretty cool. Where should I send it? His boss at the Mercury Lounge said, well, I know some people at Rough Trade Records in England. Rough Trade got this demo and basically loved it from the moment they heard it and signed it on their label. It wasn't like they didn't send them back to the studio to re-record it. We did no more mixing past the demo stage. They just released that record and then brought the band over to England. So they went from playing free shows at small clubs to suddenly touring across the ocean. There was a specific spirit that started during the recording of the demos. They were so fucking serious about their music and their recording that each person was paying attention through the entire session to every detail, whether it be the hi-hat, the tempo, the guitar solo, whatever, the transition between one part. It wasn't like these guys were out drinking beer and telling jokes while I pressed buttons in the studio. They were clustered around me all the time. For every song I ever recorded, it was the same thing. They were just on it with like laser beam focus on every moment. It was incredibly challenging because they all were so intelligent and bright. They had their own ideas and their own suggestions, and sometimes all 5 of them would be talking at the same time, telling me to turn up a hi-hat, brighten a guitar, change the EQ on something. You know, it was incredible amounts of work, not because they couldn't play well, just because they really had specific ideas about their sounds. I started to notice what I hadn't noticed on stage. When I saw them, I didn't know what to think of them that much. But when I actually started analyzing the music and working with it in the studio, really hearing each part clearly, I was thinking, this is a very strange situation. We have a time period in history where nobody's interested in rock music, and this band is reminding me a little bit of the Stooges with Iggy Pop and a little bit of the Velvet Underground, which even in the whole history of rock at that time, those were very minor bands that no one really liked when their albums came out. They were both dropped fairly quickly, going against everything in the mainstream and the counterculture. The Stooges and the Velvet Underground were just like so opposite of what was happening in America. And here's these young kids coming at a time when rock is already being questioned, and they're referencing something that's so obscure. Like, I just felt sorry for them. Like, God, if I showed this demo to any record label in America, it would go into the trash can as soon as they heard the first guitar. They go, what is this horrible, out-of-date sound that has nothing to do with drum and bass, hip-hop, and pop that's happening? Like, what can we do with this? That was my first thing I felt. Then, all of a sudden, when Rough Trade signed them, and suddenly they were being put articles about them in the Rolling Stone magazine in the US, like, all this buzz exploded. We heard that Kate Moss and Radiohead were in the audience of their very first shows. This band just comes over on one song that they had released, and suddenly everybody wants to know about them. So when they came back for the the album, there was my inner climate, which was, this is exploding. Everything we do in this studio, everybody's waiting for, and this could be my big moment to have something that I have worked on go into the public ear. This is incredibly exciting. For them, it was like, okay, we are signed now. We have one chance to do a great job on our album, and if we fuck up, we'll never be a band again, and no one will know about our music. And if we do a good job, things are going to go really well for our songs. It was this kind of double energy going on.
Lyrically, the album also deviated from the current zeitgeist, where pop mostly consisted of banal and sanitized rewrites of what middle-aged corporate songwriters imagined teenage feelings to entail, and both mainstream rap and new metal dealt with adolescent frustration and aggression. Is This It felt like an accurate documentary of the overall joy and instability that comes with teenage life. Dancing, sex, drugs, slackerdom, budding relationships, it's all here, presented with tons of humor, urgency and authenticity. This is about cool kids having fun, being stupid but laughing about their own stupidity. Sonically, the driving staccato guitars cleverly dance around Casablanca's vocal melodies, dropping from new wave to punk, at times even briefly flirting with ska rhythms. Compared to the heavy-handed progressive electronica and metal trends of the era, Is This It was a breath of fresh air that struck the scene like a comet. Long hair came back, chucks came back, and punk came back. In a way. In the following months, dozens of budding garage rock bands would emerge, many hailing from New York, all of them embracing raw productions and a nonchalant punk attitude absent from recent eras. The rise of these bands even carried those with them who preceded the Strokes, including the Hives and the White Stripes, who had released albums earlier to decidedly smaller audiences. The success of Is This It transported over to the band's second album, 2003's Room on Fire.
In this album, they were merely taking the ideas that they had started with on the EP and the first album, and the experience of how they had been in the studio, what they learned in the studio the first time, which was 7 weeks making the first album, what they learned on the road, how to play tighter, how to play heavier, how to just be more proficient on their instruments. This was all reflected in a song like 1251 or Reptilia or things like that are just so incredibly demanding and musical. So I just think that the only difference in the real sound of that record is just that they had grown. You hear a growth in the musicianship. It doesn't mean it was as young, fresh, and party ready as the first album, but it was definitely some similar writing ideas just taken up another level.
Sonically similar, but a little more nuanced in song-by-song stylistic approach, the record was mostly embraced as a qualitative continuation. Just as good, just as exciting. Playing large-scale shows back then, the band would perform for roughly an hour in front of ecstatic crowds. Man, they were great. But then something happened. Widely documented in Lizzie Goodman's Meet Me in the Bathroom, soon to be a TV show? The Strokes battled a variety of issues that are all too common to the rock world. Drugs, label interference, bad press, age setting in, you name it. The outcome of that was 2006's wildly contradictory, hard rock influenced First Impressions of Earth. A record that's too long, too confused, and doesn't know what it wants to be. Followed in 2011 by the much better comeback album Angles, the Strokes compartmentalized the songwriting process, which led to some of their very best songs and moderately decent reviews. While their fourth album, 2013's Calm Down Machine, really seemed like the band had not that much left to say. A fun little indie album. It just kind of sat there and nobody really seemed to care. It isn't bad, it's just, I don't know, it's a weirdly anticlimactic album. So how did the new Abnormal, a record that's mostly mid-tempo, only features 9 songs, hit the zeitgeist? Well, that's easy to explain. First of all, Is This It turns 20 next year. Can't bloody believe it. In other words, that means that if you attend a Strokes concert now, you might run into people who weren't even born when their debut came out. Imagine that. An entire generation of fans that grew up with their music and had it handed down to them by older siblings and parents never even had the ability to see them live. So this marks the first occasion where the nostalgia of the millennial generation and the excitement of Zoomers, who only knew the band through stories, can rejoice within a moment of shared experience. And songs like Eternal Summer are close enough to current aesthetics for the band not to feel dated. Thinking about it that way, maybe the new Abnormal hit the same funk-inspired notes the Stones also managed to reach with Some Girls Adults back in 1977. Both are wave albums, both are quite tame, but also hit the current fashion trends. Even the singles seem slightly similar. Then there's the political aspect of it all. Yes, the Basquiat cover art speaks for itself. But when Is This It came out in late July 2001, it felt like a breath of fresh air, which was then suddenly cut short by 9/11, only to blossom in the anti-Bush Jr. climate that followed. In a way, the Strokes worked as the soundtrack to that era, but never fully translated to the Obama years. Now, at the tail end of Trump Era 1, with a brash title, highly politicized Basquiat cover, they managed to document a collective fatigue. People aren't quite ready to dance yet, but the quiet grooves of The Adults Are Talking and At the Door, mixed with some dark undercurrents, see for example the harsh outro of aforementioned climate change anthem Eternal Summer, elevate the record above generic radio-friendly indie. I think this is due in large part to Rick Rubin, who just came off of delivering the most convincingly well-rounded Smashing Pumpkins record in years. It's almost like he's now the go-to guy to return former rock gods to their full glory, sound-wise. But most of all, if you compare the aesthetic displays of 2000 and 2020, they are quite similar. Again, as I laid out before, the market that was oversaturated with rap and pop is shockingly similar to the current mainstream music landscape. So much so that critics constantly tout the death of guitar music, which is quizzical, given that acts like Deer Hunter, King Cruel, Soccer Mommy, and Daughters all sell out whatever venue they play at. Point being, there's an audience for indie rock, but there's been very few releases that have been acknowledged by critics as exciting the kids and being milestone of their years. Which is crazy. Have any of you been to a Mac DeMarco show lately? Seriously, people are throwing bras at the stage. It's wild. In short, it's clear that rock isn't dead, but it's not really getting the credit that it should as a pop cultural movement. In a way, the new abnormal is the great uniter. It updates the Strokes of old while also showcasing what made them so popular in the first place. It's everything that's been exciting about indie while also embracing characteristically chill Zoomer vibes and embracing political positions of our times. It's a record that is going to significantly overstay the appeal of its direct predecessors, because its songs and aesthetics are significant to the moment that it emerged in. It's bloody great, and even Pitchfork and Fantano can't stop its rise to popularity.
From the stock market to the talk it, Little Richard was the real one. The one and only, maybe. So you have this cat coming out of Macon, Georgia, which if you don't know, and those of you who aren't familiar, at least in this time of his upbringing, it was not the spot to be. It was Georgia, and during racial segregation, structural racism, and lynchings, and black people in America, African Americans, were living an experience that was incredibly rough. They were in the midst of incredible repression, incredible white supremacist terrorism. But at the same time, there was some really interesting stuff happening, and there was an aesthetic that black people were forging. And so you have this character, Little Richard, coming out of the Pentecostal tradition, which in itself has its own tradition of life against death, introducing brightness into the void of life, trying to put your mark in the world even though the world resists. And you know, this character comes out, changes the game, and he takes on a lot of things. You know, he's black, he's homosexual, in a time when there were socially and legal codes against personal sexuality itself, but actually then even his homosexuality. They persecuted people, and they legally, laws were passed, and maybe some states, I think today, some states still have the laws, they're just not enforced. But there are better people on that than me who know more about that, so I won't go into that. And you have this guy. Also, he had a birth defect. He was born with a leg shorter than the other. He had basically a weird gait. And if you ever seen Little Rich walk, he walks kind of funny. That's something he incorporated. It's his style. And I think that's interesting, that what would probably hold most of us back, he turned it into his weapon, his way of expression. And he's done that constantly. So we talk about his influence and how he claims to be the architect and innovator. And I think that's true. I think that's partially true. I think it's not that true. He was one of the architects. You could consider Chuck Berry or something like that. And he brought this tenacity, this ferocity, this little person with all these things that would have seemed like, reasons not to even go outside, and he takes on them, confronts them seriously, courage. And then by doing what he's done aesthetically, shows us that we can do the same thing. We can also rise to the occasion. So I asked myself, something, of course, we've got many examples, but can artists today rise to the occasion? Are they capable of rising to the occasion? Are artists today capable of, essentially, not just artists too, but it also challenged all of us to kind of maybe, especially in these times, these difficult times, to look in and take appreciation of what we got, but also see that humanity's always faced challenges. We're gonna keep facing challenges, and if we refer to these people, and if the music, helps us get through those challenges, then its value is already right there. It's self-evident. So I think we can take a lot from the story, even the legend, because I think there's a legend involved in this. There's always a legend when you have these autobiographies. There's never the exact detail of it, because nobody can ever have a full grasp on the truth. I don't care what they tell you, you can't. It's impossible. My opinion, though. And we can go forward and march and go outside, and not literally go outside. I highly recommend some of you guys playing some crazy games. Don't be doing that. Don't be killing nobody. Keep your Rona to yourself. And we can go on and do better things. And we have an example of people who have faced adversity, who sang through it, tried to find some cheerfulness. They found in the ruins. In philosophy, they say ontological, phenomenological ruins. The very act of being ruined and turned out into something constructive and productive, and still had enough to give, and is gonna keep on giving long after, obviously, his death and ours, as we all are mortal. I think the legacy of Little Richard is not lost on anybody who takes a little bit of time to appreciate it. And the thing that's really great, of course, is that while, of course, it speaks a testament to the African American experience and the history that we've gone through, that it belongs to everybody, it belongs to human history. It's open for everyone. It's open to interpret. And I think that's the real beauty of it. And that really rests on our shoulders of mankind. Look at me getting all magical, really, but mankind can rise to the occasion and take the past, not dwell on it, not get stuck in the who did right. The past is not beautiful. It was never perfect. We have to live with it. And what do we build in the future? I think that's where we have to always be orientated, of course. And these things can set us free. Try to some ways find connections here and there, and we can go on. Yeah, there's no doubt. He was a giant, and we're poor for losing him, but that's the way it is. Nobody gets to stay here forever. The show must go on, people. Rest in peace, Little Richard.